It was Christmas Eve, 1945. In Fayetteville, West Virginia, the Sodder family was celebrating, and George and Jenny Sodder had 10 children. One was away with the army, but the other 9 were home. The older kids, Marion, John, and George Jr., were excited. Their mother, Jenny, had let them stay up late to play with new toys. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, the younger ones, were upstairs, likely asleep. The house was full of life. It was a cold night, but inside, everything felt warm and safe. By the next morning, that feeling would be gone forever. 5 of the children would be missing, and the world would be left with a question that still has no answer. What happened to the Sodder children? The story really starts with George Sodder. He wasn't from West Virginia. He was an immigrant from Italy, arriving in America when he was just a boy. He worked hard, started a trucking company, and built a good life for his family. They had a big house and were respected in town. But George had strong opinions. He was very critical of Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy. He wasn't shy about saying what he thought, and in a community with many other Italian immigrants, his views sometimes caused arguments. Some people didn't like what he had to say. This might seem like a small detail, but it could be the key to everything. Jenny Sodder was the heart of the family. She ran the busy household and raised the 10 children. Their life was a version of the American dream. A big, happy family living in a 2-story house that George had built himself. They had a garden, the kids had their chores, and they were part of the community. But just beneath the surface, there were signs of trouble. A few months before the fire, a stranger came to the house. He tried to sell George life insurance. George said no. The man became angry. He told George that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed. He made a strange comment about George's anti-Mussolini talk. George dismissed him as a crank, but the threat lingered. Later, another man came to the property looking for work. He went to the back of the house and pointed to the fuse boxes. He told George that they were going to cause a fire one day. This was strange because George had just had the house rewired, and the power company said it was perfectly safe. The night of the fire, the strangeness continued. Around 10 p.m., the phone rang. Marion, the oldest daughter, answered it. A woman on the other end asked for a name she didn't know. Marion told her she had the wrong number. She could hear laughter and clinking glasses in the background like a party was happening. She thought it was just a simple mistake and hung up. Later, Jenny woke up. She noticed that the lights were still on and the front door was unlocked. This was unusual. The kids usually took care of those things before going to bed. She turned off the lights, locked the door, and went back to sleep. She assumed the kids who stayed up late had simply forgotten. Around 1 a.m., she was woken up again. This time by a loud bang on the roof, followed by a rolling sound. It sounded like something had been thrown up there and had rolled down. She didn't think much of it and fell back asleep. It was a decision she would regret for the rest of her life. Just 30 minutes later, she woke up for a third time. This time to the smell of smoke. The house was on fire. George's office, on the ground floor, was burning. Panic set in. Jenny and George started screaming, trying to wake everyone up. They got themselves and 4 of the children out. Marion, John, George Jr., and the youngest, 2-year-old Sylvia. Marion had to carry Sylvia out. John and George Jr. ran out with their parents. They were all downstairs. But the other 5 children were trapped upstairs. Maurice, age 14. Martha, 12. Louis, 9. Jenny, 8. And Betty, 5. Their bedrooms were on the 2nd floor. The main staircase was already a wall of flames. There was no way to get up. George, frantic, thought of a plan. His big ladder was always leaning against the side of the house. He would use it to climb up to the children's window. He ran outside into the freezing night. But the ladder was gone. It wasn't where it always was. It was nowhere in sight. He had another idea. He had 2 coal trucks. He could drive one up to the house and climb on top of it to reach the window. He ran to the trucks. He tried to start the first one. Nothing. It wouldn't turn over. He tried the second one. Nothing. Both trucks, which had worked perfectly the day before, were dead. The family was helpless. They could only stand outside in the snow, watching their home and everything in it burn to the ground. Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department, but their phone wasn't working either. Someone else had to drive into town to find a phone that worked. Even then, help didn't come right away. The Fayetteville Fire Department was just 2.5 miles away, but they didn't show up for hours. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, later said he couldn't find his firefighters. He claimed he had to call them one by one, but couldn't reach them. The fire started around 1:30 a.m. The fire truck didn't arrive until 8 a.m. By then, there was nothing left to save. The Sodder family home was a smoldering pile of ash and charred timber in a basement filled with debris. The assumption was simple and tragic. The 5 children upstairs had died in the fire. The family was heartbroken, the community mourned with them, it was a terrible accident. But very quickly, things started to seem less like an accident and more like something else. The first major red flag was the fact that no remains were ever found. Not a single bone. Not a single tooth. Nothing. The fire chief told George that the fire had been so hot it had completely cremated the bodies. He said the wood-burning stove and the coal in the basement made the fire hot enough to turn bone into ash. George and Jenny, in their grief, accepted this at first, but Jenny couldn't shake a feeling of doubt. She started to do her own research. She spoke to an employee at a local crematorium. The employee told her that human bones remain even after being burned at 2,000 degrees for over 2 hours. A house fire, even a hot one, wouldn't get that hot or burn for that long. It simply wasn't possible for 5 bodies to be completely destroyed without a trace. Just 5 days after the fire, the coroner issued 5 death certificates. The cause of death for each child was listed as fire or suffocation. This seemed incredibly fast, especially since there were no bodies to examine. The official investigation was closed. To the authorities, the case was over. A tragic fire. An open and shut case. For the Sodders, it was just the beginning. The lack of remains was the first piece of a puzzle that would consume them for the rest of their lives. George, wanting to create a memorial for his lost children, made a decision that would complicate the mystery forever. He brought in a bulldozer and filled the basement with 5 feet of dirt. He planned to plant a flower garden on top. At the time, it was an act of a grieving father trying to create something beautiful out of a place of horror. But in doing so, he destroyed whatever evidence might have been left at the fire scene. He had effectively buried the crime scene. Later, people would question this. Why would he do that so quickly? But in the fog of grief, people do things that don't always make sense. As the days and weeks passed, more strange details came to light. A telephone repairman came to check on the Sodders' phone line. He discovered that the line hadn't been burned through in the fire. It had been cut out. It was cut at the top of the pole, about 14 feet up. Someone had deliberately severed their connection to the outside world. Then there was the ladder. George's missing ladder wasn't just misplaced. It was found a few days after the fire, thrown into an embankment about 75 feet from the house. Why would someone move it and hide it? The only reason would be to prevent a rescue. And witnesses started to come forward with their own odd stories. A bus driver who passed through Fayetteville late on Christmas Eve said he saw people throwing what he called balls of fire at the Sodder house. This lined up with the sound Jenny had heard on the roof. Another woman who was watching the fire from the road said she saw a man at the scene, taking a set of block and tackle, a tool used for removing car engines. And the Sodders owned a set just like it. It was missing after the fire. Why would someone be stealing equipment while a family's house burned down? Jenny also found a small hard rubber-like object in the yard. It looked like some kind of bomb or incendiary device. The family began to believe the fire was not an accident. They believed it was arson. The family started to put all the pieces together. The threats against George for his anti-Mussolini views, the man who warned him about faulty wiring, the cut phone line, the dead trucks, the missing ladder, the object on the roof. It all pointed to a deliberate act. But if the fire was deliberate, what happened to the children? If someone set the fire to kill them, why were there no remains? This led the Sodders to a new, terrifying conclusion. The children hadn't died in the fire. The fire was just a distraction, a cover. They believed their children had been kidnapped. This theory seemed unbelievable to many. How could 5 children be taken from a burning house without anyone seeing or hearing anything? But for the Sodders, it was the only explanation that made sense. It explained the lack of bodies. It explained all the strange events leading up to the fire. The motive, they believed, was tied to George's Italian heritage and his outspoken politics. Perhaps the mafia, or someone with fascist sympathies, had taken his children as revenge. The Sodders decided to take the investigation into their own hands. They felt the local police had given up too easily. They hired a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley. Tinsley started digging, and he uncovered one of the most disturbing parts of the whole story. He learned that the fire chief, F.J. Morris, had told people a different story than the one he told the Sodders. Morris had apparently found something in the ashes. He claimed it was a human heart. He said he had secretly buried it in a metal box at the scene. He did this, he said, to spare the family more pain. When George confronted Morris about this, the story changed. Morris led him to the spot where he had supposedly buried the box. They dug it up. Inside was not a human heart, it was fresh beef liver. It had not been touched by the fire. Morris then admitted he had put it there himself. He said he hoped that if the family found remains, they would stop their investigation and accept that the children were dead. This was a bombshell. The fire chief had lied. He had planted false evidence. Why? Was he just trying to help a grieving family find closure in a misguided way? Or was he part of a cover-up? Was he trying to stop the Sodders from finding out the truth? To the family, this was proof that someone in a position of power was hiding something. The Sodders pushed for the case to be reopened. In 1949, they convinced a pathologist from Washington, D.C. to conduct a formal excavation of the site. The search was thorough. They sifted through all the dirt George had used to fill the basement. They found a few small objects, some coins, a dictionary, and a few small bone fragments. The bones were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. The report that came back was shocking. The bones were human vertebrae, but they belonged to a person who was between 16 and 23 years old. None of the missing Sodder children were in that age range. The oldest, Maurice, was only 14. The report also stated that the bones showed no signs of being exposed to fire. And there was another strange detail. There was no sign that a cemetery had ever been on the property, but the pathologist noted that it was possible the dirt George had used to fill the basement had come from somewhere else, and the bones had been in the dirt. So the only human remains found at the site of a fire that supposedly killed 5 children belonged to an older person and had never been burned. The mystery only deepened. With the official channels exhausted, the Sodders turned to public appeals. In 1952, they put up a large billboard along Route 16, near their home. It showed pictures of the 5 missing children: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. It told a brief version of their story and offered a $5,000 reward for information, which they later raised to $10,000. The billboard became a local landmark, a haunting, constant reminder of the 5 lost faces. It was a symbol of a family's undying hope and their refusal to undying hope. Over the years, tips and sightings trickled in. A woman who ran a tourist court between Fayetteville and Charleston claimed she saw the children the morning after the fire. She said they were in a car with 2 men and 2 women, all of Italian extraction. The car had Florida license plates. Another woman, a waitress at a Charleston hotel, said she saw the children about a week after the fire. She said she served them breakfast. She remembered them because the adults they were with were aggressive and wouldn't let the children speak. She said she tried to talk to one of the boys, but one of the men gave her a menacing look. The Sodders followed up on every lead. George traveled to different states, chasing down rumors. He went to St. Louis after a woman wrote to them claiming that Martha was living in a convent there. It wasn't her. He went to Texas and Florida, following other tips. Each time, it was a dead end. Each time, their hopes were raised, only to be crushed again. The years turned into decades. George Sodder passed away in 1969. He died without ever knowing what happened to his children. He never stopped believing they were alive somewhere. Jenny continued the search. She wore black for the rest of her life, a symbol of her mourning. She tended the memorial garden she and George had built where their house once stood. She never gave up hope that one day, one of them would come home. Then, in 1967, something happened that gave her a new reason to hope. She received a letter in the mail. It was postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. There was no return address. Inside was a photograph. It was a picture of a young man in his late 20s. He had dark, curly hair and dark eyes. He looked remarkably like her son Louis would have looked at that age. Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie a little, boys 89132 or 35. The message was cryptic. Frankie could have been a reference to one of their older brothers. The numbers were a mystery. Oh, was it a code? A zip code? A military ID? The Sodders were convinced it was Louis. Hired another private detective to go to Kentucky and investigate the letter. The detective took their money, went to Kentucky, and was never heard from again. The trail went cold once more, but the family held on to that photograph. It was the last real clue they ever received. Jenny Sodder died in 1989. She passed away still believing her children were alive. After her death, the family finally took down the weathered billboard that had stood for almost 40 years. The remaining Sodder children, and now their children, the grandchildren of George and Jenny, continue to discuss the case and keep the memory alive. Sylvia, the youngest child who was carried out of the fire, is the only one of the Sodder children who was there that night who is still alive. She still believes her siblings were taken. So what really happened? There are 2 main theories. Each has its supporters, and each has its problems. The first theory is the simplest one. The children died in the fire. This is what the authorities concluded back in 1945. The argument is that the fire, fueled by coal and old timber, was indeed hot enough to destroy the bodies. The lack of remains is unusual but not impossible. Perhaps the search in the immediate aftermath was not as thorough as it should have been. George bulldozing the site certainly didn't help. All the other strange events, the cut phone line, the missing ladder, the non-starting trucks, could be a series of incredible coincidences. The sightings of the children could be cases of mistaken identity by people who wanted to help. The fire chief's bizarre behavior with the beef liver could have been a clumsy attempt to give a grieving family closure. In this version of the story, the Sodders, unable to accept the horrible truth, built a conspiracy theory to cope with their loss. But there are so many problems with this theory. Too many coincidences. Why would someone cut the phone line? Why would the ladder be moved? Why would both trucks fail to start at the exact same time? And the central problem remains the complete absence of any human remains. Experts today still say it's highly improbable that a house fire could completely obliterate 5 skeletons. You would expect to find something, even just teeth or small bone fragments. The fact that nothing was found is the biggest argument against the fire theory. The second theory is that the children were kidnapped. This is the theory the Sodder family believe. In this scenario, someone with a grudge against George Sodder, perhaps related to his anti-Mussolini statements, or a business dispute, planned the abduction. They cut the phone line to prevent a call for help. They disabled the trucks to stop George from using them. They moved the ladder to block any rescue attempt. Then they started the fire, possibly with a firebomb thrown on the roof as a diversion. While the family was panicked and distracted by the fire, the kidnappers took the 5 children from the house. This theory explains all the weird events of that night. It explains the threats against George. It explains why there were no bodies in the ashes. The sightings, if true, would support this idea. The cryptic letter and photograph of the man who looked like Louis would be the final, heartbreaking piece of evidence that at least one of the children survived. But this theory has its own set of problems. It would have been an incredibly complex and risky plan. How do you quietly remove 5 children, ranging in age from 5 to 14, from a house in the middle of the night without them screaming or waking the rest of the family? And if they're kidnapped and raised by someone else, why did none of them ever try to contact their family once they grew up? Even if they were told their parents were dead, it's hard to believe that none of them would ever uncover the truth about their past. It would require a lifetime of silence from many people, the kidnappers, and the children themselves. The case of the Sodder children is so compelling because neither theory fits perfectly. They died in the fire theory requires you to accept a long list of unbelievable coincidences and to ignore the science of how fire affects the human body. The they were kidnapped theory requires you to believe in a sophisticated conspiracy and a lifetime of silence from the victims. In the end, we are left with no answers. We are left with the haunting image of a family portrait with 5 faces missing. We are left with the image of a mother in black, tending a garden where her home used to be. We are left with the ghost of a billboard on a lonely West Virginia highway. The story endures because it speaks to our deepest fears. The loss of a child is the worst thing a parent can imagine. But the loss of a child into thin air, without knowing if they are alive or dead, is a special kind of torment. It's a wound that can never heal, a question that can never be answered. George and Jenny Sodder lived in that state of uncertainty for the rest of their days. They searched for their children until their last breath, but the mystery of what happened on that cold Christmas Eve, the mystery of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, remains. Lost in the fire or stolen in the night, we will probably never know.